My family moved when I was in the middle of second grade, so when I got to my new school, I knew literally no one. There was also a grade-level wide field trip the first week I got there, and during the ride over I sat next to some kid I'd never seen before. At least I had the window seat, and the kid I was sitting next to was quiet. This particular field trip wasn't to a museum or anything, rather, we were just visiting this really large park. As I'd find out later, this was a yearly trip, but I'm glad I never had to go back there, and you're about to hear why. Our bus pulled into the parking lot 30 minutes after we left the school, and as we started parking, everyone began yelling. Our teacher, Mrs. Taylor, and the parent chaperones tried to quiet everyone down as she explained that we needed to stay with our group, and that we'd be meeting at the Grand Pavilion at 11:30 for lunch. As we filed out of the bus, we were divided into groups of 6 kids, after which each group began walking towards the play equipment with its chaperone. I was sitting near the back of the bus, so I got put in the last group. I recognized 3 of the kids from my class, and though we'd later become friends growing up, I don't think I even knew their names at this point. When we got off the bus, our chaperone asked us where we wanted to go. We looked around, and only then did I realize just how massive this park was. I don't even think it seemed big because I was a little kid. There was literally play equipment spread out over the size of a football field, and that was just what I could see. Eventually our group decided to start walking and explore, as a lot of the equipment near the parking lot was already occupied. There was a small hill with a sidewalk winding around it in the distance, and one of the kids in the group named Joey really wanted to run up it. We were all on board with that idea, so we started walking over. About halfway to the hill, we passed by this area that had some of those plastic tubes with small holes in the side. I could swear I heard someone inside say my name through one of the holes. Instinctively, I looked up and saw someone pressing their mouth against one of the holes. I had no idea who that could be, but the mouth didn't look normal somehow. Like it was open taller and more narrow than it should have been. I continued to stare, more out of curiosity than fear, and momentarily stopped walking. Then our chaperone looked back at me and asked me to keep going, so I did, not really giving what I saw a second thought. 2 minutes later we reached the base of the hill, and Joey and the rest of the kids started laughing as we began to race each other up the winding sidewalk. Our chaperone was fine with us running on the sidewalk, as she could just walk directly up the side of the hill. I remember there was some kind of monument at the top, and each of us sprinted to touch it first. We all started yelling and laughing, then looked over at the park. Again, this place was ginormous. I think it was inside a forest preserve, as there were woods far away on all sides except where the road led out. As we were running around and looking at the monument, I could have sworn I heard my name again. I couldn't tell from how far away, or even in what direction, but eventually my gaze settled on the woods furthest away from the parking lot. There, standing right at the edge, was a figure all in black. I couldn't make out what it was wearing, but somehow it didn't look like a regular person. For one thing, whoever, or whatever, that was tall, like 6'5", and for another, they were really skinny. Their upper bodies seemed to be abnormally long compared to their legs. It also didn't make sense how their voice had reached me from so far away. I considered telling the chaperone, but decided against it and just started running around again with the other kids. Eventually we went back down the hill and onto some other play equipment. Nothing else happened there, so I'll just skip forward to lunch. The Grand Pavilion was this huge concrete structure with tons of those outdoor green tables made of metal coated with plastic. It had a very large, upward-sloping wooden roof made of several sections, and there was also a part that had circular concrete steps that went down into the ground, which I'm pretty sure was for watching plays. I had started to make friends with Joey and the other kids in my group, so even though I had been a bit weirded out by those 2 incidents from earlier, I'd managed to put it out of my mind. That is, until we were almost done with lunch and I heard my name again. This time I heard it more clearly, but I still couldn't pinpoint exactly where it came from. After I looked around and didn't see anyone, I decided to check by the amphitheater, as it just seemed like a natural place for someone to play a joke and duck down out of view. I'm not sure what exactly I was expecting to find, but when I walked over and peered down, all I saw were the empty concrete steps. I was just about to go back when I heard my name again, this time from right behind me. I turned around and saw an image that still haunts my nightmares. There was a man dressed in all black looking down at me. I assumed this was the same figure from earlier, and now that I saw his face, I was shocked at how long and narrow it was. It was almost like a cartoon character. Maybe for that reason, the man's smile was extremely disturbing. I immediately screamed and ran back to where my group was sitting. Apparently no one had noticed me walk away, since they were surprised to see me come back. Now here's the weird part. I fully expected our chaperone to be angry or concerned and start asking me why I screamed, but she didn't. It didn't even seem like anyone heard me scream in the first place. A second later, when I looked back in that direction, the man was gone. One of the other kids in our group asked me what happened, and I honestly didn't know what to say. For a split second I considered telling them that someone had been calling my name and a man had just snuck up on me, but in the end, I didn't. I didn't tell anyone what happened, and eventually we got back on the bus, and I never went back to that park or saw whoever that was again. Thankfully we didn't go back for another field trip, as the following year we started going to this museum instead. Years later, I can't help but think back about this experience. The obvious explanation is that I just imagined the whole thing, and I've told myself it was just the stress of moving and changing schools and not knowing anyone else on the field trip. But deep down, I don't know how much I believe that. I wouldn't say I was a particularly anxious kid, and I had never imagined or hallucinated anything like that before or since. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that at least part of what I saw and heard did happen. For the record, I don't believe in ghosts or other paranormal entities, but I also don't have a super good explanation for what happened. In the end, I'm just glad we never went back to that particular park, and I hope I never see anyone or anything like that again. My brother Tony used to work for a company that sold play equipment, like at the playgrounds you'd find at parks. He lived out of state, but we'd usually take a family trip to see him once or twice a year. On one of our trips, when our two young kids Mike and Sarah found out about their uncle's job, they immediately wanted to see where he worked. I'm sure they envisioned him working in the middle of this huge playground, but actually that wasn't too far away from the truth. There was an office building connected to two large warehouses, and outside was a sprawling setup of all their play equipment in a field of those rubber chips. To be clear, I don't think this was intended to be an actual playground for kids, but rather a place where prospective buyers could look at the equipment. It was late evening when we finally got into town, and Tony had told us to meet him at the office before heading back to his house. The moment we parked and my wife Cindy finished unbuckling the kids from their car seats, they sprinted to the unlocked gate in the fence surrounding the play equipment. Cindy called after them, but they were already gone. My brother and I laughed as the three of us started walking over. As we just completed the second full day of driving, it felt good to get out and walk around. The kids also needed to get some energy out before bed, so this was a win-win situation. Mike and Sarah got on this seesaw before splitting up, where Mike kept going down this one slide and Sarah worked her way through these monkey bars. Like I said, this place was massive, and there was like a 100-foot unbroken course of different types of monkey bars. Eventually Sarah got to a particularly difficult part and called out for help, so I went over while my wife and brother stayed with Mike. I put my arms around Sarah and lifted her up enough to reach the higher bars, and she continued going across them and said she wanted to try the next set on her own again. I laughed and told her to see how far she could get. While Sarah kept moving from one bar to the next, I took a look around again and let my eyes zone out. There was a nice cool breeze blowing, and I yawned as I followed behind Sarah. Just then, I heard a metallic clank come from somewhere in the distance. It sounded like a rope hitting a flagpole, and I assumed it was from one of the pieces of play equipment. It wasn't in the direction of the others, and scanning the surroundings, I didn't see anyone else there. I chalked it up to the wind pushing something and continued to follow Sarah. Sarah made it about halfway through the course before getting tired and walking over to an area with different types of swings. There were these large tire-like objects suspended from 4 chains, and Sarah and I both sat inside one of them while I pushed us with my feet. Sarah found this hysterical, so we did this for several minutes. Then Mike and my wife and brother found their way over to us and started playing on another one of the swings. Just then, I heard the metallic sound again. My wife heard it too, and we both looked in that direction, which was almost the opposite direction from the first sound I had heard. I asked Tony if there was anyone else here, and he said no. It was after 6 p.m. on a Saturday, so I'd assumed no one else was in the office or warehouse. I asked Tony if kids ever snuck onto the equipment, and he told me that there'd only been a handful of cases. Apparently we weren't near any neighborhoods, which made sense since we were in the outskirts of a city in a more industrial office park type area. Then Tony asked me why I asked him. Apparently he hadn't heard the noise just now. I told him about it, as well as the one earlier, and he seemed unsure of what that could be. Cindy looked concerned now, whether it was because of hearing the noise herself or from this conversation, and suggested we should go. Tony reassured her that we were safe, but since the sun was already setting and we needed to unpack our stuff, we all agreed it was time to go. Or I should say, we adults, because Mike and Sarah definitely did not want to leave just yet. My brother was quick to point out that we could come back tomorrow, and mentioned that he'd gotten them a few toys that were back at the house. That seemed to help, and we slowly got off the swings and started walking back to the gate, with Tony and Michael leading the way and my wife and I walking with Sarah about 20 feet behind them. But then, I caught sight of something which is still burned into my retinas to this day. About 100 feet away from us, and nearby the gate, there was a figure standing on top of the play equipment. It was one of those multi-level playscapes that had ladders and ropes leading from one level to the next, and whoever that was standing on the very top platform, holding onto one of the supports, being completely still. The person was wearing all black, including a mask, and their head was pointed in our direction, so I can only assume they were looking right at us. My blood ran cold, and I began thinking about how best to alert everyone without causing them to panic. Both our minivan and my brother's truck were parked right on the other side of that entrance, and based on how high up that guy was, I felt like we could make a run for it and lock ourselves inside before he got to us. I'm not sure if this was the right call to make, but in the moment I felt it was best to not let on that we noticed that person standing there. If I told Cindy, there was a good chance she would start screaming and freeze, so I didn't. Instead, I kept my eyes locked on our vehicles and that person in my peripheral vision. Tony and Mike reached the gate first, and I quickly unlocked the doors. Then Sarah asked if we could go out for ice cream, and Tony started thinking of options. With my heart pounding in my chest, I tried my best to calmly tell Sarah we'd discuss it on the way and to just get in the car. Unfortunately, Mike started pleading with us as well, and my wife picked up on my tone of voice and asked what was wrong. I did my best to keep that person in my peripheral vision while not making it obvious what I was looking at, and told Mike and Sarah in a stern tone to get in the car or there wouldn't be any ice cream for the rest of the trip. That seemed to work as both kids got into their respective doors. My wife started to buckle Sarah into her car seat, but I told her to just get inside while I closed Mike and Sarah's doors remotely. They started protesting that they weren't buckled in, but I told them to be quiet. Then my wife got in and closed her door, and I immediately locked it. Now very concerned, Cindy asked me what was wrong, and after I looked over and verified that Tony was in his truck, I pointed out the person to Cindy. She screamed, and a moment later Sarah screamed as well and Mike began crying. I raised my voice slightly and told everyone to calm down and hold onto their seats as I started backing away. We drove out of the parking lot and back onto the main street, and then I put on my hazard lights to signal to Tony to pull over. I stayed in the car while Cindy quickly got out and fastened both children in their seats, all the while on high alert for any other cars pulling up behind us. When Tony got out and walked up, I explained about the figure, and all he said was, "Oh shit." He told us to go to his house while he called his boss and the cops. Cindy got back in the car and we drove over where my sister-in-law Lauren greeted us. She was obviously shocked when we told her what happened, and started apologizing even though it wasn't her fault. Tony got back 2 hours later, at which point our kids and even Cindy had calmed down a bit. But what he told to me and Cindy privately was nothing short of terrifying. Apparently he met 2 police officers in the parking lot and they conducted a search of the premises. They didn't have to go far though, because right on the piece of equipment the person was standing were 5 large kitchen knives. The cops called for backup, and Tony's boss arrived half an hour later, but they didn't find anything else, and whoever that person was gone. Cindy and I decided not to mention this to the kids, and aside from this one incident, the rest of the vacation went as planned. I spoke to Tony about what happened after the police concluded their investigation in the following weeks, and despite dusting for fingerprints and reviewing surveillance camera footage, no suspects were ever identified. Therefore, I can only guess at who that person was, or why they decided to come there. Tony told me he hadn't even let his boss know that I'd be stopping by with my kids, and the business was usually deserted at that time, so no one at the company could have known there'd be people there. He also said that nothing remotely like that has happened before or since. In the end, I can only assume that that person was mentally disturbed in some way. And while I'll never be able to know why they came there, I still shudder at the thought of what they might have done to us if things had turned out differently. My family and I live just outside of Santa Fe, and we try to take the kids for one longer road trip each summer. We went to Disney World twice and even drove all the way to New York once, but on this particular summer we are driving to St. Louis to see the Arch and a few other things. Our two sons Tim and Jake were 9 and 7 respectively, and thankfully still really enjoyed road trips. We decided to split the drive into 2 days and spent the first night somewhere in Oklahoma. It was only like 5 p.m. when we got to the hotel, and after checking in and checking out the pool room and exercise room, we decided to just drive around and explore while also finding a local restaurant to eat dinner. The La Quinta we were staying at happened to be located in a rather nice area, and when we were cutting through this random neighborhood, we stumbled upon a huge playground. I'm not sure exactly what the deal was, such as whether it was managed by an HOA or the city, but it was massive, stretching as far as we could see on one side of the road. Tim and Jake were immediately excited, perhaps partly due to riding all day in a car, so we pulled over and got out. My wife Claire reminded us we still had to eat dinner and told the boys they only had 15 minutes to explore the park. It was also now sunset, and we wanted to get on the road earlier the next day. Tim and Jake ran over to the spinning ball on a pole that was made out of ropes he could climb on, and ran around as fast as they could while Claire and I sat down on a nearby bench and smiled. At first it seemed like we were the only ones here, but after a few minutes a girl walked over to where Tim and Jake were and joined them on the spinning rope thing. She looked to be around their same age, and they all started yelling and laughing. A minute later they stopped and got off and ran further into the playground. Instinctively my wife and I got up and began following the boys, eventually calling their names as they started to leave our field of view. Neither Tim nor Jake turned around, and I could see Claire was annoyed. Therefore I began to run after them. 30 seconds later I caught up to them on the other side of the playground. I told Tim and Jake sternly that they shouldn't have run off like that, even if they were with someone else, but honestly after driving all day I was willing to cut them some slack. Both boys said sorry immediately, and Jake told me that the girl, whose name was Tiffany, told them there was going to be a surprise here. I instinctively asked, "What surprise?" and both boys shrugged their shoulders. Looking around, I saw Tiffany wasn't with them anymore, and asked them where she went. Jake wasn't sure, but Tim pointed to this plastic tube entrance. I walked over and looked inside, and noticed it was a slide. It seemed like it just went into the ground below the playground, and I could only see down about 20 feet before it became pitch black. I called out, "Anyone down there?" only for the sound to echo back. Honestly, it was pretty creepy. I stood up and looked around, expecting to see some kind of pit or large piece of equipment that could have been a clubhouse type thing. But there didn't seem to be anything like that. We were literally in the middle of the playground. There was a gentle slope down to a pond with a fountain about 100 yards away, but it made no sense for this slide to connect that far. While I was creeped out, I was also genuinely curious now. I asked Tim when Tiffany had gone down the slide, and he said right before I got there. I asked him what she said was down there, but they didn't know. Claire walked up and I showed her the slide, and she was immediately freaked out and said we should leave. Honestly, this was a very dumb idea, but Claire saying what she did made me feel an urge to explore the slide. Over her protests, I turned on the flashlight on my phone and shined it down. I couldn't really see anything else though. By this time, Tim and Jake had started cheering for me to go down there, and I decided what the hell. After watching my wife give me one final exasperated look, I started sliding. The slide was actually fairly slippery, and had I not been propping my feet up against the sides, I might have slid down a bit too fast. The whole time I kept my phone pointed forward, and after passing through what was the edge of darkness, I came out into this large circular room. It was about the size of a garage, and the walls were made of standard playground metal and plastic pieces. There was some equipment in the center, including those mazes you can trace with your finger, and on 4 of the other wall panels there appeared to be tubes leading to other places. I was honestly pretty blown away that something like this was even here. It was pitch black aside from my phone, but at the top of this room was a circular plastic piece, which I assume was supposed to funnel sunlight down from the surface. The sun hadn't finished setting, so there should have been light coming through, but I guess the top was covered up with wood chips or something. Claire called down asking if I was alright, and I yelled back that there was an entire room here. I heard Jake and Tim start begging their mom to let them come down, but she refused. Instead, she told me in a worried tone to come back up, and I figured this was enough of an adventure for now and we could come back tomorrow if we wanted. Now I just needed to figure out which of the other paths would be easiest to take back up. I assumed at least one of them had to be stairs of some sort, but I was blown away again when I realized that each of the 4 tubes apparently led to another underground room. This is when the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up, and I contemplated just trying to climb back up the slide versus exploring the other rooms. I walked back over the slide and braced my feet against the walls, but again, it was pretty slippery. Jake saw me and started laughing, and I did the best I could to smile and conceal my genuine fear. Claire stuck her face into the slide and asked if I was going to try to climb back up, and I stopped and just said no. Then I said there were other ways up, and I was just going to go up another way. I stepped back into the room, now feeling my heart beating in my chest. The fact that some random girl had just disappeared down here and was nowhere to be found hit me, and my heart started to beat faster. I walked over to one of the tubes and shined my light inside again. All I saw was an empty room. I got down on all fours and climbed into the tube, coming out into a room pretty much like the first one. This one had more of those maze-type activity panels in the middle, as well as along the walls. But there wasn't any way out besides the way I just came in. I got on all fours again and climbed back into the tube. My family members had stopped talking on the surface, which made the situation even more disconcerting. I climbed through another tube to find a similar room, again without another way out. Now I was starting to panic. After crawling through the next tube, a weight lifted off my shoulders when I saw what appeared to be a stairway on the other side. I'll never be able to describe in words the raw emotions that surged through me when I looked up the stairway to see the silhouette of a person holding something in their hand. I screamed and ran back and flung my body into the tube. My wife's panicked voice came down the slide as I desperately tried to crawl back up. Thankfully, the adrenaline pumping through my veins gave me a boost, and I was able to make it all the way back to the top. I screamed to my family to run, and we made a beeline back to our SUV. As they were putting on their seatbelts, I threw it in drive and didn't stop until we were back at the hotel. Only then did I explain what I just saw. Claire started freaking out while the boys both went silent. We talked things over for a few minutes, and ultimately decided to call the cops and report what we saw. We ended up meeting them in the parking lot and gave a statement, then went back to our hotel room. Instead of going to a restaurant, we got room service, and though it was a bit more expensive, we all felt safer in our room. I'm not sure how much of an investigation was done, but my family and I got back on the road early the next morning and never received a phone call after that. Claire did the best she could to put what happened out of her mind, but I could tell it was hanging over her for the next couple of days. The boys seemed to be fine, and though they and I got to a place where we could start to joke about what happened, I didn't do that for Claire's sake. The rest of the trip went well, and eventually we made it back home without any further incidents. I still think about what happened every week or two since then. The person standing at the top of that stairway definitely didn't look like a 9-year-old girl, but I think it's possible that she was part of whatever that person had been planning. As to what they had been planning, I honestly don't know. I entertained the idea of a group of neighborhood kids planning to prank someone, but there was just something about how that person was standing there. Also, with how they were holding something ominously in their hand, I doubt their intentions were innocent. However, from what Tim and Jake told me, Tiffany seemed friendly, so maybe she wasn't in on it after all. At this point, I'll know I'll never know, but I do know one thing. Don't slide down a random slide underground.